Test, 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 test. It's a lot of juice back there, James. Test, test, test. Test, 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 check. Okay up there, Paul? Okay, thank you. Everybody waits till the last second, including me. Don't tell anybody I'm drinking that in here. I'm not supposed to be, but I gotta have something to get me through this. I haven't eaten since whatever that was, 6 this morning. So. What? You should go eat? Is that what you said?
She said you should eat so you don't fall on the floor.
Yeah, I know. It's much better if I don't fall on the floor. Glasses, that would be good. Okay, I have our sign-up sheet from last week. If you were not here last week or you didn't sign last week, if you could just give me your name, email, phone, and whether or not you have been baptized, and then we'll figure out the rest later, okay? Do you need a utensil? Good, all right. Yeah, if you signed last week, yep, I've got it, okay. All right, good. So last week, I had 2 handouts for you, and I wasn't ready. One of them is about women in the early Christian mission. to give you some sense of what place women had in the early church. So I have a list of all those folks for you. And on the other side, I have the development of Roman papal authority. We talked about the fact that this happened over a long period of time, that the Bishop of Rome was understood as different than other bishops. So this gives you a list of that. And they're back to back. So just grab one if you want one, or don't, and pass it out. And that's just from last week. Okay, anything left from last week that you all left here and said, oh my gosh, we didn't even talk about this, or this doesn't make any sense? Anything from last week you want to bring up before we jump in? We won't be quite as crazy this week as we were last week, so we can you can ask. We can be more of a dialogue today, okay? Anything? Nope. Okay. Okay, good. The thing that I want to bring up from last week that we just touched on very quickly, and that's because somebody asked a question about, it was your husband, I think, about the Eastern Church, about how did the East and West split, and I suggested that they were never really together. So the great schism in the church was 1054, when the eastern part of Christianity split from the western part. That was the official date that happened. But as I suggested last week, the theology in the Eastern and Western church was always very different. And as I suggested last week, in the Episcopal Church, we are actually much closer to Orthodox thought than we are Roman thought, especially around the issues of baptism and confirmation, that kind of thing, okay? So I want to point out the schism because I think there is some merit to Phyllis Tickle's idea that every 500 years the church changes, turns into something very different. So at the year 500, actually 420, was the collapse of the Roman Empire, and the Christian church became something totally different than it was during the Roman Empire and when Constantine was there. And then in the year 1054 was the Great Schism, and the church split in half, the Western and Eastern church. And today we're going to talk about the Reformation, generally speaking, around 1500, and what happened then. And the thought process is that our 500 years is up. And that means something dramatic is going to happen again. And I am definitely in that camp. I think the church is changing dramatically right now. And here at Grace St. Paul's, we're trying to stay on top of that wave, but we don't know exactly what's going to happen and what that's going to look like. But compare what we do here to what you did in your mother's Episcopal church or any other tradition. I mean, it's way different. So what that's going to look like, of course, is open to debate, and we'll see. But I do think we're in one of those reformational periods right now. Okay, let's talk about the Reformation. So let's start with the fact that there are lots of links between the Roman Empire and Great Britain. Constantine's father was from York and died in York. Britain was a piece of the Roman Empire. It was not a backwater. And from the beginning, England is a mix of cultures coming together. Greco-Roman, Celtic, Latin Christianity coming from Rome. In the 7th century, Theodore of Tarsus is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they have Eastern. They had a Greek Orthodox bishop, and the church is kind of unified in what becomes the Church of England. I just want to set that before we start the Reformation part. Okay, so here's the Reformation that you all know about, that everybody talks about. So whose name is associated with that? Right. So Martin Luther's, the Reformation that Luther starts is very theological. It's about all the stuff that's happening in the church that he wants to change. We talked about some of that last week. We particularly talked about indulgences that we made fun of at Mardi Gras on Tuesday when we sold you indulgences. We were making fun of that theology that people came to priests so that they would pray, do votive masses for their family who had died, etc. The church was completely separated from what was actually in the Bible, and they created this whole sacramental thing that was very different. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. He was in the church, but he thought some of this stuff was really weird, okay? So we're going to get into that. What do I have next? Genevan? The Genevan Reformation. Anybody want throw a name at that? Thank you, Jackie. John Calvin. Zwingli is also a big part of the Genevan Reformation, and that is also a very theological movement. It's very much a statement that things need to change in the church. And then the last one on there is the English Reformation. The English Reformation happened way after the other two. When they were happening, England stayed part of the Roman Catholic Church. And what caused the English Reformation was more of a constitutional crisis. Only much, much later did it get theological, not until the 1600s. Okay, so that's really different than what you may have learned in school or anything else. Should I go there? No, let's not go there yet. Okay. So the medieval church is very unified throughout Europe. There's a canon law, and that's pretty universally accepted. And for you living wherever, there are two powers over you, a secular sovereignty and a priestly power. So, I mean, everybody was under that same kind of thing. Now, there's some breakdown of all of this in the 15th century. I quickly mentioned last week when somebody brought up Avignon that at one point there were 3 popes in Avignon, and there was this papal schism at that time. There was other stuff happening in the church. There was a guy named John Wycliffe in around 1375 that kind of started the roots of the Reformation. Wycliffe argues that the Bible is the sole criterion of doctrine to which no ecclesiastical authority can add anything, suggesting that this whole thing about priests being able to make decisions for you was bogus. Wycliffe said that the authority of Pope was ill-founded in Scripture, that you couldn't find anything in Scripture about it. He denounced friars, asked the government of England for a complete reform of what was going on in the church. He attacked transubstantiation. And if you were here last week, you remember our conversation about transubstantiation, that there was some real presence in the bread and wine. He attacked that. He said it encouraged a superstitious attitude towards communion. We talked a little bit about that last week. So Wycliffe came up with some of these early thoughts that started this kind of thinking, okay? But back to Germany, where the big thing happens. So somebody throw at me what Martin Luther attached to the cathedral doors. Anybody know what those things were called? Somebody who went to school recently knows this. So they were called the 95 Theses, and he had this list of 95 grievances he had against the church that needed to be settled. He, of course, opposed the sale of indulgences to finance the building of St. Peter's in Rome. And the main statement that Luther makes that starts to stick is that salvation comes by faith through grace alone and not any human merit. So it's very different than what the Catholic Church, the Roman Church, is teaching at this time, that you needed to go through the sacramental rite and the priest needed to absolve your sins for you to be okay. Luther says, nope, salvation comes by faith through grace alone, and you don't have to do anything about it. It's just God acting. And of course, the famous phrase that becomes associated with Luther is sola scriptura, the Bible only. All we need is the Bible. We don't need all this other stuff that the church is putting around here. All we need is the Bible. He supported vernacular liturgy, but he did not forbid Latin. You know what I mean by vernacular? That the service is in the voice of the people wherever you're living. So, Latin was throughout the Roman Church. So he supported this change to people praying in their own language. But he didn't forbid Latin, but he encouraged that to happen. He also encouraged congregational participation in the liturgy. What an idea, because remember what we talked about last week with ocular communion, and they're holding up the monstrance, nobody's taking communion, the priest is up here whispering the Eucharistic prayer because nobody even knows what the heck he's saying anyway. So Luther starts to encourage congregational participation. He tells people to go to communion. What a concept. He encourages people to listen to the word, but pray and to sing hymns, to do all of that. So that was cool, okay? So that's quickly what Luther's up to. All right, Geneva. So John Calvin, the Frenchman, has a really different take here. And Calvin is very much an Augustine of Hippo kind of guy. And what I mean by that is he believes in double predestination, meaning that before you were born, it was decided whether you were going to heaven or hell. It's all done. There's nothing you can do about it. He also preached the total depravity of humanity, that we are all worthless worms and there's nothing we can do about it. The way I'm saying this may sound a bit pejorative, and I apologize for that because I'm not a fan of John Calvin, but I want to represent him well. Those are the main things that he talks about. He says that the word alone is all we need, that all the other accoutrements in church are just accoutrements, and they have nothing to do with connecting us to God. So remember the whole fight about icons that we talked about last week and all of that? Calvin says we don't need any of that stuff, okay? So he took this thing and he put it right here, and he got rid of this table, and he got rid of stained glass, and he got rid of candles. You came to church and all you saw was a pulpit, and you walked in and the priest talked to you for 2.5 hours and then you left. That was it. It was the word alone. That was all you did, okay? So really different in that way. Ulrich Zwingli, in the meantime, in this same idea, he preaches against the adoration of saints and relics and also indulgences. He also talks about scripture over dogma. He denounced the sacramental view of Eucharist and clerical celibacy. How about that one? And so those two guys are kind of forming this new thing that's happening in Switzerland and France. Okay? Yep. Ulrich Zwingli, is that who we're talking about? Yep. Zwingli. Okay? So out of that conversation will be the first Presbyterian movement, and that produces the Anabaptist movement. and this whole idea that it reinstituted a baptism of believers, that you didn't need to be baptized because nothing was going to happen to you, and I'm totally on board with that. So they didn't baptize kids. They baptized believers, adult baptism. That, by the way, was denounced by Luther, but that came out of this movement, okay? So that whole Anabaptist movement is started as a result of this, but Zwingli, Calvin, and Luther all said, no, we didn't mean that. So, but it still happens anyway. So eventually, monasteries in Switzerland and France, there's this move to eliminate monasteries and all religious images from the church. And that very much happens in Zurich at this time, okay? So, so they're a little different. They're majorly different. I mean, Calvin and Luther had very, very different theologies. And I hope I'm hitting on the biggest aspects of each, okay? Okay. Meanwhile, in England, they went through this entire Reformation that was going on in the rest of Europe with little change. There was this battle for ecclesiastical power among the kings. And by 1450, the king sent a letter to the Pope and told him who to appoint for every bishop position and every position in the church. So, kind of, the king was running the boat anyway. And in very few cases did the Pope argue with that, okay? So, you know, there is no separation between church and state, of course. And the kings pretty much got what they wanted in the church, so they didn't touch anything. So throughout the 16th century, pretty much, England was a highly religious country compared to the rest of the continent. The church intervened in people's lives, just like today in like Israel or Afghanistan. Think about it like that. And apparently, there was not much dissatisfaction with religion in England at the time. Now, you take that for what it's worth. You know, I think I would have been screaming and yelling up and down like Luther was, but in England, that apparently was not happening. People weren't terribly upset with the church. Okay? 1509, Henry VIII comes to the throne. Lutheranism is hatched in England, and it's very influential at Cambridge, especially. Not as much at Oxford, but very much at Cambridge. And this guy named Thomas Cranmer comes on board, very influenced by Lutheran thought, and Cranmer starts to put this together in England. Henry uses Lutherans as allies for political purposes, but he never really finds any fondness with the Reformed doctrine. Henry VIII was very Catholic, and he stayed very Catholic, and all this stuff, he didn't care about the indulgence stuff and all those things. He pretty much stayed there. There was also another movement in England, a group called the Lollards, Lollards, and that was a blue-collar movement in England. And that they become the real dissidents in England, and they are very much moving to create this Reformation movement in England too. Very blue-collar. The opposite of Luther and that movement, which is a scholarly movement. So in England, blue-collar folks are getting up in arms, but not much anywhere else. Okay? Thomas More is enlisted by Henry VIII to refute Lutheran doctrine. He wants reform, but orthodox and spiritual reform. is what he's moving towards. So in the 1520s, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey is appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, and Wolsey pushes for complete control of the church administration in England. He becomes Henry's right-hand man. They're both power-hungry individuals who want to make this happen and take over the church. It's a very power-laden movement, and it is vastly unpopular in England, as you can imagine. Wolsey shows Henry, though, that the church and the state could rule as one in England, and that's what they're both moving towards. Maybe we can get all of this, and we don't need no stinking pope at all, and we can just run the whole boat by ourselves. Then comes the event you all know about, the divorce. So remember first that the term divorce is not like today's term. A divorce meant an annulment. It meant an annulment in the Catholic Church. And Henry asks for an annulment from the Pope. The issue he uses is that Catherine's former husband was Henry's elder brother, Arthur, and that in England that would not be legal. So that only a papal dispensation allowed that. So that's how he argued to get this. I think what's most important is that you realize that this was a day-to-day request for popes. Popes got requests for annulments every single day, not always from a king, but they got them all the time. In fact, that still happens to this day. If you're in the Roman Church and you really want to do this, you go to the Pope and ask for an annulment. So people don't do that as much today, but in that day it was happening a lot, okay? So if Henry had gotten the annulment, England would have stayed Roman Catholic, but as you know, that didn't happen. So instead, they have to take another approach to try to get full power here. So in 1529, Henry looks for a theological argument to convince the Pope. He appoints Thomas Cranmer, who says that it's null and void, and they try to push that with the Pope. In the meantime, Henry has already secretly married Anne Boleyn, forgetting that the Pope hasn't given him an annulment, okay? So then Pope Clement finds out that he did this, so he excommunicates Henry from the church. Still, nobody in England seems to really care much about any of this, because nobody really liked Catherine. I'm being of course some people did, but most people did not like Catherine anyway, so they said, okay, who cares, big deal. And it's England, right? We're never going to get too excited on one side or the other, right? We're gonna. That's our Anglican blood, right? All right. So they have to do something. The Pope turns them down. So in 1534, the king puts together the Act of Supremacy, saying that the King of England is the only supreme head of the church in England. So that's the break, folks. I know you all learned in school that Henry VIII created the Anglican Church. Henry VIII didn't care anything about any of the theology. All he wanted to do was get the power, okay? So that's what's going on here. Nothing changes in England, okay? The next week when you went to church, it was the same priest. He was doing the same Eucharistic prayer in Latin, and he was still doing everything exactly the same. Nothing changed until the monasteries. Henry was running out of money in many different ways. And when he realized how much money was tied up in the monasteries, he thought, I have an idea. So he started dissolving monasteries, and that's when everybody in England went berserk, because monasteries were really, really important to them, and that's what set everybody off. Okay? All right. You got that? You good here? Everybody good with what's really happened? Okay. So Henry was followed by Edward VI, the boy. Nothing really happened during that time. But from 1547 to 1553, Thomas Cranmer starts trying to begin to define Anglicanism, because now the church is thrown out of the Roman Church, so they have to kind of figure out theologically who they are. So Cranmer was the one that came up with that book in front of you, that Book of Common Prayer, okay? He did that in 1549. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's how that started, as he tried to do this. Then came Lady Jane Grey. Nothing else really happens until we get to Mary I. Someone will say the pejorative name of Mary I. Go ahead. Yeah, I heard you. Who said that? I heard it. Thank you, Sarah. Bloody Mary. Oh, I didn't say that. Did you? Sarah said that. So Mary was on the throne from 1553 to 1558, and during that time, England went totally back to the Roman Church. They already are basically theologically Roman Catholics, but during Mary I, they went totally back. So the Church of England is the only religious body in Europe in which the battle between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation had not yet been decided. So England is once again Catholic. So this whole notion that Henry VIII formed the Anglican Church is pretty much non-existent. There's nothing there to it. The church was, all those 6 years later, was completely Roman Catholic again. Okay, then comes Elizabeth I, yes. Okay, let me get your microphone, because I got all in trouble last week to not get you. No, we have to do it for the live stream. Okay, sorry. Or I have to repeat what you said. No, it's for the live stream, so people can hear your question.
Now I forgot my question.
Oh, sorry.
So when you say they went back and
Yep.
were Roman Catholic again,
Yep.
so the Pope just said, "Oh, okay, you're good."
Pretty much.
Okay.
Pretty much. Henry's gone, so we'll take you back.
Okay.
Yep, pretty much.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you.
That's good. Thank you.
No punishment. No, they didn't have to buy any indulgences.
Yeah, well,
Do
I'm
confession.
not positive about that. You might have something there. Okay, so next is Elizabeth I. That's good. So Elizabeth reigned, as you probably all know, a very long time, 1558 to 1603. So it was under Elizabeth that Anglicanism actually begins to be defined. And they do say that Anglicanism is different than Roman Catholicism, and it's different than these other two Reformation movements. And they start trying to define what that's all about. So how much should we do this? So think about what's happening in the world. You have the Roman Catholic tradition, this set of sacraments that you have that save you by you being infused with the grace from these sacraments so that you can be eternally saved. Whereas in this Protestant movement, in both the German and Genevan form, we are created fallen. You can lose it even if baptized. That sacraments strengthen you, but they don't give you that. Reformation prayers say that are there to simplify, to make more intelligible what's going on. They turn the Mass into a communion service, not a sacrifice. And you got these very different theological ideas going through here. So in the middle of that, England tries to define what this new thing is that they're calling Anglicanism. Before I start with that, let me say that the final break with Rome didn't actually occur until 1570 when Rome breaks with England, all right? So technically, that's what's happening, all right? So England now needs to define Anglicanism, and the guy that you need to know about the most is Richard Hooker. And I would suggest that Richard Hooker is probably the most important name in the history of Anglicanism. I'm going to go that far. So, Elizabeth asks Richard to go through this process. And Elizabeth has some heart for many Protestant changes, but she's also Catholic in many ways. So Hooker starts to talk about all of that. And he takes the theology from these other things and he goes, well, yeah, Luther's right that Scripture's really, really important. And the Roman Church is right that we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, that tradition is important to us, and there is such a thing as a communion of saints, and we are connected to all those people that came before. He said, though, Luther's wrong that it's just Scripture. It's not just Scripture. It is also tradition. Both of those things are really important to us. But the thing that set off Anglicanism from all the other reformational movements is that Hooker added a third leg to this. And his third leg was reason. Folks, we got to think this out. This whole idea that you can just make this so black and white and say that all you need is the ancient tradition of the church or all you need is the Bible, he said, is a bunch of bunk. That we need to use our heads, we need to think this out. And so yes, Scripture and reason Scripture and tradition are totally important to us, but the thing that sets us apart is the third leg is reason, that we need to think this out and figure out what we're supposed to do with this. To this day, that is the major difference between Anglicanism and every other tradition, that we're supposed to use our heads to figure this out. And sometimes it's not simple, but that's what it is. So he holds on to part of what Luther's saying. He holds on to the ancient tradition, but he adds this reason. And balance becomes the central role of Anglicanism, much more so than any other denomination. And that's what sets us apart more than anything else. Okay? All right. Good? Everybody good with that? Obviously, Hooker wrote books and books about this. And if you can slog your way through it, there's good stuff in there. But it is a slog, I'll tell you. Okay? Yep. Oh, sorry, I'm doing the microphone again. Otherwise, I have to repeat everything you said. So,
I guess when I'm thinking about, the importance of reason, the importance of analysis, it feels like the, followers of Luther, or that approach, the Catholic approach, would also consider that they themselves think and value reason and value analysis. They would say that's one of our values as well. Is that right, do you think?
I don't think you can say that because it was pretty black and white in the Roman Church at that time. Take part in the sacraments, do this, do your Easter obligation, be baptized, and you're saved. You know, it's not that different than and I'm going to use the word fundamentalist because that was the word they used when it started here, and we'll get into this later. Fundamentalism is today, which is believe in Jesus and you don't have to worry about anything else. So I would suggest, now this is me speaking, okay, and I'm editorializing here a bit. I would suggest that the Roman Church's understanding, at least at that time, that if you follow these rules, you're safe, you don't need to worry anything, was not about any kind of thought process at all. It wasn't any real articulation of anything. At least that's what they were saying out loud. Were there Roman Catholic scholars? Of course there were. And of course they were having these battles in seminaries and stuff. But what the church was preaching is that you do this and you're okay. And Hooker is arguing out loud that is not the way we see this at all. Okay? Okay, good. All right. So, England falls into civil war when we get to the 1600s. And you know we have another religious movement in England, Puritanism. So the Puritans get very strong in the 1600s in England, and they actually abolish the Episcopacy, and the Church of England ceases to exist again when we get into the 1600s after Elizabeth is gone. The Puritan movement, as you probably know, was not very popular in England because it was a despotic movement and it was very extreme. I think most of you have some sense of what Puritans believed, and it was far to the right of John Calvin's approach. So that movement is not terribly popular. As we talked about, extremes on either side never held for very long in England and still don't to this day. The prayer book in England was actually written, the next prayer book in the series of prayer books was actually written after the Puritans were pushed back out. And that was written in 1662, okay? And folks, believe it or not, that is still the official prayer book in the Church of England, the 1662 prayer book. So if you think we're struggling with the 1979 prayer book, which is totally out of date, imagine what it's like in England. I wonder why nobody's going to church there. So, sorry, that was more editorializing, sorry. Okay. All right. Cool? All right. So, and I'm not going to go through all the history. You know what happened, the revolution that happened there. But by this 1650-something, the Puritans were pushed out. So, you know, they sent boats here so that they could bring that theology to the U.S. So that's where we're going to go next. Everybody okay? Pick up any of that? Okay. So, to America, to the United States. It wasn't the United States then, but I got to have some way to differentiate between the North American continent. So, coming here, Anglicanism was the first denomination to arrive, not the Puritans. Somebody know the first settlement here in America? What? Jamestown, thank you. Gosh, you guys are making fun of me now. Okay. So, yeah, everybody thinks about the Puritans and the Mayflower in 1620, but it was actually Jamestown in 1607. So, the Church of England that comes to the United States is very low church. Do you all know what I mean by low church? Okay. So, looking at it today, a high church here would be like St. Michael's and All Angels, where Sister Susan comes from. St. Michael's has all the smells and bells, and I don't mean that pejoratively. They have incense in every service. They ring bells throughout the Eucharistic prayer. They do. There's lots of ornamentation and what's going on. Low church is like, this is how I dress for church. That there's no accoutrements at all. It's kind of like John Calvin on steroids, just the pulpit and that's it. So that's low church and high church. So the Church of England that comes here is low church. Morning and evening prayer attendance is required daily. There are 2 sermons on Sunday, and you have communion about once every 3 months. That's the kind of the makeup of the liturgically what the church is that comes here, okay? From 1607 to 1740, there is an explosive growth of the Church of England all over the place, but especially in Virginia. The Virginia legislature actually made a law that no settler could be more than 6 miles from a church. So you like that? By 1671, there were 48 Anglican parishes in Virginia. After 1700, more and more clergy are educated in the United States. How was that possible, that a clergy could be educated here? Anybody know a college here that might be able to do that goes back that far? I heard it. Yes, William and Mary. So William and Mary is where most of the clergy are being educated here. So from 1723 to 1776, the church continues to grow exponentially. The clergy are very highly educated compared to other denominations. And that becomes one of the hallmarks of the Episcopal Church in the United States. And it becomes more important here than it does in England. So the clergy, the education of clergy here, by that point, by 1750, the clergy here were generally more educated than were clergy in England. It became a very, very important part of them. So up to the Revolution, almost all Virginians belonged to the Church of England. And 30 years later, those 107 parishes went down to 35. Why, you might ask? Anybody? Something happened in 1776? We told those people from England to go get lost, right? So there's this church called the Church of England, and we have broken ourselves away from it. So that gets very interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Going back to 1699, an act of religious toleration was passed, but the Church of England was still the main church throughout the 13 colonies. Okay, and I'll get into that a little bit more. Okay, so this is the time of deism in Europe and what's happening in the United States too. Does anybody know the term deism? Go, Jared. Yeah, you want to take a crack at that?
God created us. Oh, sorry.
Yep, that's okay. Thanks.
That God created us and then just decided to abandon and kind of let us do our own thing?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. So think about deism as God as the great clockmaker, and God starts the clock and then just laissez-faire, stands back and lets everything run. So deism is a very popular understanding in this time period. It's a very rational, common sense kind of thought process. Some people would call deism the forerunner of secular humanism today. So the majority of our founding fathers were deists. Okay, they were almost all Anglicans, but they were also deists. So that is what our heritage is. I always love it when evangelical folks say, we want to go back to the church of our founding fathers. Really? You want to be deists and Anglicans? That's what you want? So anyway, just to give you some sense of that, so, most of the founding fathers went to church semi-regularly, but they all understood God in this kind of deist fashion. George Washington, for example, went to church about once every 5 Sundays. Ben Franklin, James Madison, John Jay, Patrick Henry, and 2/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglicans, okay? Many of them were also deists. But that's 2/3, folks. So, that's a lot. So these folks start to envision an Episcopal church without a tie to the government. And of course, that is a totally irrational thought in the world at that time. And that is a major thing that happens in the formation of this country. 45% of the Virginia clergy were pro-patriot, and nearly all the laity. So, it was a really difficult thing, people deciding what to do here in all of this. We had 250 buildings in the country at the time of the Revolution, and it was down to 35 by 1810. So let's talk about areas. In New England, by 1700, there were more Congregationalists than anything. Congregationalists, so like the UCC church today, that would be Congregational, come down from that. And Anglicans were second, but there were Anglican churches from Massachusetts to South Carolina. The Anglican Church in America, though, is forming very differently than in England. Obviously, this country is very pluralistic very quickly. The Church of England is in every colony by the Revolution. The church is characterized by lay rule. So lay leaders are running most of the churches in this country. And why would that be? How are we going to get a bishop? Because how is a bishop? What happens? How do you have to have a bishop? You have to have 3 other bishops to lay hands on somebody's head. And what are we going to do? Go to England to make that happen? So we're getting to how they handle that. So laity have much more authority in the church in the United States than they do in England. So there you go. There are 2 factors in the church decline. Obviously, the ties to England during the Revolution. And then the other thing that affected the Anglican Church immensely was the Great Awakening. Do you all know something about the Great Awakening? So it was very much a movement of the heart. It was a very extemporaneous kind of thought process. I had a teacher once that called it classical Protestant doctrine in enthusiastic clothes. So the Great Awakening was a major movement in the United States and is very different than any other religious movement in the world. The Great Awakening appealed to folks who didn't have as much education because it was a very heart-based, charismatic thing. And the Church of England, remember, is becoming even more educated and more elite. So this Great Awakening thing doesn't work with Anglicanism much at all. So those 2 things really affected the church here. And still, early in this movement, we have no American bishop. And there's a real movement to figure out what to do about that. Let's see. So as we talked about, Franklin, Washington, Madison, John Jay, all those folks envision an Episcopal church without government ties. So they meet in Maryland in 1780, and that is when the actual American church is set up. Does anybody know what the church was called when it was first formed? It's actually in the beginning of your prayer book. You don't have to look, I'm going to tell you. It was called the Protestant Episcopal Church. So you get what they were trying to do here, right? We're Protestant, we're definitely with the Reformers, but we're also Episcopal, meaning we're going to have bishops, and we're not going to lose that ancient tradition. We're going to put both of those things together. So they set up principles for a church that's not linked to the government. They affirmed that threefold ministry of deacon, priests, and bishops. And they also talked about this democratic approach to religion, with clergy and laity making every decision in the church. And that has stuck with us to this day. Folks, I can't make any decision in this church without you telling me it's okay. So we're still that. We try to balance clergy and laity, and we'll talk about that when we get to the polity class a lot more. So the church actually required lay participation. So in your prayer books, at the beginning is a little historical piece that we've kept from that 1789. I don't have it in front of me. Somebody find it and yell me out a page number. Did you find it? The preface? Yep. So the preface on page 9, that is from 1789 and the Congress. So some of you have heard me say in church that when the United States government was formed, that half of those people literally walked down the street. I thought it was across the street until I was in Philadelphia and I did it. And it's actually down the street to Christ Church in Philadelphia, and they formed the American Episcopal Church. So that preface is from 1789. So what they did at that point was just take every reference to the king in the book and cross it out and replace it with laity or clergy or whatever they could make to make that happen, okay? So this idea that lay people had to be part of the church, that is probably the biggest contribution of the Episcopal Church to the Anglican Communion. And now, in all the churches in the Anglican Communion in the whole world, that is the goal, is to have lay people and clergy together. So, and we're going to talk about that when we get to our polity class, but that really is the great gift that we've given to the whole communion, okay? So, now we need a bishop. We have a church and we have no bishop, so what are we going to do? And Samuel C. Berry is elected to be the first bishop. I know Samuel C. Berry gets crushed in Hamilton, but C. Berry's not a bad guy. All in all, he was backing England at the beginning of the Revolution. It's true, but he has other qualities too. Anyway, he was elected to be our first bishop. That becomes another hallmark of the church. The Episcopal Church is the first church since the early days of Christianity to elect their clergy, to elect a bishop. So that becomes a big part too. So to be a bishop in the Church of England, you had to take an oath to the king. That's not going to happen. We weren't going to do that. And apostolic succession remains important, as we talked about last week. So how are we going to get a bishop to lay hands on them? So does anybody know what we did? There you go. Scotland saves the day. So the Scots say, we'll do it, because remember in Scotland, there's this whole group of bishops that left England. They're called the non-juring bishops because they wouldn't take that oath to the king. And so they're in Scotland. So there's this whole group of non-juring bishops. So they were the successors of the high Tory English clergy who refused to swear their oath of loyalty to James II. And that's how all that formed. So they said, we'll do it. So Samuel Seabury got on the boat and goes to Scotland, and there you go. So that's how that happened. So our roots are actually Scottish, much more so than they are English. And just to remind you all of that, during Lent, our Eucharistic prayer, the second half of our Eucharistic prayer is from the Scottish liturgy. And I only do that to remind you all of our roots in the Scottish church. Okay? So there you are. All right. So we wrote that prayer book in 1789. It's not much different than the English book, except taking out the king. We wrote another one in 1892, and then the ones that some of you who have been in this church a long time know about, the 1928 prayer book. There are still actually churches in the Episcopal Church who only use the 1928 prayer book. We'll talk about that later. And our most recent prayer book is the 1979 prayer book. And that's where we had that new theology of baptism, where adult baptism actually became normative. Living into that is a totally different thing. But we've had 4 prayer books, okay, over the years. And we'll talk about that more in another class. So the church is dying off post-revolution. There are 10,000 Episcopalians out of 4 million people during the revolution. The nation is rural and our church is urban. By 1825, the church is depleted and in dire straits. And what revives the church is an evangelical movement, and this movement to mission, to going out to the world and telling people about this church. There are lots of people who are big in that evangelical movement, and also an ecumenical movement. The Episcopal Church in the United States from the very beginning has been very ecumenical and looking for ways to tie ourselves with other denominations and other faith traditions. And we have an entire history around that. William Muhlenberg was one of the guys who set that up in the back of your prayer book. There in the historical documents, there's something called the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral. That's all about trying to bring churches together. So sometime when you're totally bored, you can read that. But we've been very much an ecumenical church, trying to tie ourselves with other groups. And that's really what grew the Episcopal Church the most, okay, is that movement. One of those people was Absalom Jones. I mentioned him a couple weeks ago. Absalom Jones was the first African-American priest in the Episcopal Church, and that's the statue in Philadelphia that was taken down recently because you don't want to hear about slavery, right? Okay. All right. So there are 2 kind of general movements in the U.S. church. One is called the Oxford movement, and the other is an evangelical movement. That's kind of high church and low church. The Oxford movement was to bring back, remember the church that came here was pretty low church. So the Oxford movement came to bring back some of the accoutrements and stuff. So in the Oxford movement, there was suggestion that we should put candles back out, that I should wear an alb instead of a suit to church, and those kinds of things. So we tried to balance both of those things. So by the 19th century, there were Episcopal missions to the Far East and to Africa, and then later to China, Japan, Mexico, and the Philippines. What spread Anglicanism in the world was not England, it was the United States. We're the ones that sent out all those missions to other places. In the latter half of the 19th century, there were discussions around the liturgy and what that's going to look like, and that's when that Oxford movement started happening. But the social action of the church, social justice, becomes the most important thing to come out of the church. And that happens mostly during the Industrial Revolution, when people are working ridiculous hours for no pay, and the church decides that the most important thing we're going to be able to, that we can do, is to take care of folks and to make those laws fair. So social justice really becomes a major part of the church during the Industrial Revolution. Let's see. We got some people that were involved in all those kind of movements. I don't know that we need to go through all those folks. So by the beginning of the 20th century, the church moved from certain death because of its attachment to England to becoming an integral part of American life. And some in this country begin to see it as the most important church in the United States. Not the biggest, but the most important. And those of you who have been around a while know that most people in politics in the United States from 1920 to 1980 maybe, were Episcopalian. And they weren't Episcopalian necessarily because they believed in this theology, but it was the thing you represented to be in a position that you could get elected. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And there are positives and negatives to all of that too. But the church grew into a very elite church by the time we got to the 1950s. It was seen as the church of thought and that kind of thing. Two other major events in the world right before this caused a lot of other turmoil in all religions. And the first was in 1859, this little book somebody wrote called The Origin of the Species. And so Darwin had a major effect on religion at that time. And the other thing was this process called biblical criticism, which began in Germany. And that was the thought process that we should look at the Bible as any other piece of literature and try to look at it like anything that you were looking at, and try to make academic conclusions about where this happened, and you use context and all of those things. Those two things just changed the whole face of religion in the entire world. Anglicanism handles both, while most other religions want to throw both of those ideas out completely. We did not go there. So first of all, you may know that Charles Darwin was a deacon in the Anglican Church. So we, as a general rule, this tradition has never had any issue with the idea of evolution. We're pretty much totally on board. It makes total sense to us. So it was never really an issue in this church. And we were all kind of scratching our heads going, what are these people all upset about? And the same thing with biblical criticism. We wanted to look at the Bible as anything else and use context and decide did somebody in the first century write this, and who were they speaking to when they did, and what does that mean to us? So both of those things were actually important to us theologically, but the world was really struggling with that. Okay? Let's see. We'll skip Henry Knox Sherrill and go right. So from 1946 to 1960, That became the greatest period of growth in the Episcopal Church, even more so than in the 1800s when they came back. It was a gigantic period, and as I said, many people were Episcopalian because you were supposed to be Episcopalian. That's what you did. So that was part of it. And then in 1960, something happened that stopped that growth. You're going to...
Just real quick, it seems like sometimes we use Episcopal and Anglican interchangeably, and other times we use it like it's a big difference. Should I say it again?
Yep. So the question was, why do sometimes we say Anglicanism and Episcopalianism as if it's the same thing, and sometimes we don't? That has gotten really muddied in recent years because of the bishopric and churches leaving the Episcopal Church because they didn't believe in women's ordination or gay rights or whatever. Those folks connected themselves with an Anglican church in England. So whereas we have all come out of the Anglican tradition, sometimes that word Anglican is used very differently today than it was before. We are all Anglicans, and we all come out of the Anglican tradition. But today it's a little dicey because of that, and some people equate that word with not believing in women's ordination, okay, or with LGBTQ plus rights. So that's why it's a little dicey. But we're all Anglicans, and we all come out of that tradition. Thank you, Jared.
You mentioned the African American priest in Philly.
Yeah.
And before we hit the 1960s, I just wonder how the church dealt with the slavery issue. I know in some churches it was by geography, and I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, and that is going to take us up here anyway. So yeah, we can do that right now. So this actually comes up in a later thing, but no. But let's touch on it now. Because this is really important. So, and we'll talk about this in the last class. When we talk about denominations. And denominations, every denomination, Christian denomination in the United States of any volume, split in half during the Civil War. Every single one of them except us. So the Episcopal Church stayed together, so... Like in the Presbyterian Church, there's a Presbyterian USA Church now and the Presbyterian PCA Church. That's the split from the Civil War. That's where all those, and we'll talk about that when we get to the denominations. We did not split in half, the only major denomination that did not. And that is because we did not take a strong stance in the Civil War. And we allowed stuff to happen. So was it a good thing that we didn't split in half? Y'all need to make your own decision about that. But thanks for bringing it up right now because that's what happened. So the church kept growing because everybody stayed in the church, and that's why we had this major growth from 1946 to 1960, and then it stopped because we finally took a stance in 1960. So that's exactly what happened. The church started addressing black issues. The civil rights movement became the centerpiece of what the Episcopal Church was doing. Our presiding bishop, John Hines, at the time said that social activism becomes central to us because we will consciously devote all of our efforts to black concerns. And when Hines said that and we made all these steps, Episcopal churches in the South left in droves. Entire churches left during this time. So our growth curve stopped right there. I'll let you judge if that's good or bad. The next big issue of contention was the role of women in the church. And, this is really embarrassing for me to say out loud, but I got to tell you this. The first woman vestry member in an Episcopal church was in 1970. That was when we had the first women going to General Convention. And 1974 was the Philadelphia 11. Do you all know about the Philadelphia 11? So those were the first women to be ordained priests in the Episcopal Church. That was 1974. That was an unauthorized ordination. We did it without the permission of the whole church. And folks, that's how we change things in the Episcopal Church. It's almost always grassroots. It's almost always from the bottom. It's always some priest in Tucson, Arizona, or someplace that's doing something weird and is trying to and it bubbles up from the bottom. So that's what happened. We ordained 11 women in Philadelphia, and then in 1976, General Convention approved what we did. So, I mean, that's the way we do everything. So in 1976, another whole group of churches left the Episcopal Church because they didn't want any stinking woman running their church. So there you go, okay? That's the big deal. In 1980, Episcopalians were judged in Pew, or one of those groups, as the most progressive of 23 religious denominations on the question of racial justice. So we went from not condoning or letting slavery happen to the point where we became the most important church in stopping that. In 1985, our presiding bishop, Edmund Browning, said that there will be no outcasts in this church and that diversity is our strength. In 1991, Episcopalian George Bush, preparing for war with Iraq, went to Edmund Browning first, and Browning urged him to reconsider. That was in the days when we had a lot of influence in the political world. So that's where we are. Then, of course, we have Gene Robinson, who was our first openly gay person who was ordained a bishop in the church. Gene wore a bulletproof vest when he got ordained, and because it was still a lot of tension in those times. And we had another group of churches leave during our movement. But since 1960, this church has been a church that demands that everybody be accepted no matter who they are and what's happening. Have we had fights about that? You bet we have. And General Convention has been crazy active in the and in the early 2000s too. There were times when it got really, really dicey because there were still a lot of people who weren't totally on board with bringing everybody into the church. But that's who we are. And I'll say, we're going to talk about General Convention and our polity, comparing it with the United States government. Obviously, the same people that set up the church set up the U.S. government, so our systems are very similar. But the difference is we do General Convention every 3 years. The difference for me is when we vote on a really difficult subject and somebody loses, we walk around and hug each other before we take the next vote and say, just because we disagree with that doesn't mean that we can't be together. So it's a very different vibe than in Congress. And I really think that Congress could learn a little bit from us on that, but that's another issue. We're going to talk about this in later classes, but you might ask what holds the whole Anglican communion together, and it's not much because we're very theologically different, and that's why the United States Episcopal Church is different than the rest of the Anglican Communion, especially on those social justice issues. But what we say holds us together are, quote, bonds of affection, unquote. So while we disagree on many things theologically, what holds us together is that. So the Archbishop of Canterbury calls all the bishops together every 10 years at the Lambeth Conference, and we talk about all these things. But remember, folks, the church can never make any decisions without you saying yes. So the lay people have to vote on things. A priest can't do it by themselves. Or if they do, they're going to be in big trouble. So, okay, good? So what are your questions? We're good. We got a couple minutes. Sarah?
Well, while those people were leaving over the civil rights issue,
Yeah.
some of us were coming the other way.
Yeah,
Didn't that
thank you.
kind of
Thanks for
balance
that,
it
Sarah.
out?
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't believe the things that the Episcopal Church did in the late 60s. It was incredible.
Yeah.
And I started going to services in graduate school.
Yeah. That's what brought some of us to this church, including me. That's the reason I'm in this church. Thanks for bringing that up.
When did the term Episcopal
Yeah.
become used?
So in 1789, when they came up with the name for the church, that's when it started. So when they called it the Protestant Episcopal Church, the idea was they didn't want to say Catholic, so they said, well, what does the Catholic Church represent? And it's this order of clergy, deacons, priests, bishops. So Episcopal means of a bishop. So that's when they started using the term. And over the years, the Protestant part just kind of slipped away. But I'll occasionally still get a letter that says, from the Protestant Episcopal Church in America. So, first of all, it's not America, and it's not Protestant, but it is Protestant, but it's both Protestant and Catholic.
I travel a lot now, and how do you find a church under this philosophy? I mean, I know you can go to a Roman Catholic church anywhere and you find them everywhere, but
Yeah.
how do you distinguish between the two types?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's not easy. But basically, the Episcopal tradition is what we just said. It's still a big tent church. We got some fairly conservative liturgies and fairly progressive liturgies and everything in between. But usually under the Episcopal umbrella, you're not going to have any issues with social justice, with LGBTQ issues, with a woman's right in the church to be anything they want to be, generally speaking, because all those people left when we had the fight. So usually Episcopal's okay. If you find an Episcopal church, you're usually okay. You're going to always find stuff you don't agree with, and because that's who we are. That's what we do. But it's like when I was in seminary, one of my best friends, Sean McConnell, I'll say his name because he'd be fine me using it. He's the director of Episcopal Relief and Development now. Sean came into class one day and he said, I don't know what to do. We stopped doing the Nicene Creed in church because none of us were there. That's why we don't do it at 10 o'clock here for the most part. And he said, I don't know I have nothing to fight about in church anymore. This is no fun at all. So there is that part of who we are too, that we want to have that back and forth thing. I'll say that there are certain denominations that tell people that if they can't find their denomination to come here, Church of the Brethren, there's lots of Church of the Brethren churches back east. Church of the Brethren pastors always say if you can't find a Church of the Brethren church, you come to an Episcopal church. But mostly now it's the progressive thing. You just look for that word is the safest thing in other denominations.
I just want to say that before I moved to Tucson, I was living in Yuma for the last 7 years.
Yeah.
And I went to St. Paul's Episcopal in Yuma.
Yeah.
And we prayed every week for Donald Trump when he was president.
Right.
And for the military. So, I mean, I still like the people there, and I like the ritual.
Yep.
And I stayed.
Yep.
I'm much more comfortable here.
Yep.
But there is that diversity. It's not always pleasant, you know.
You bet. You bet.
But I still felt like I met a lot of really good people, including a lot of people going out in the community doing community work that was quite beneficial, et cetera. It really, I think what was good about it for me was it challenged my own thinking. If I want to be some progressive liberal person, you know,
Why?
You can't villainize these people every day, because guess what? There are a lot of cool people here.
Yep.
So anyway, I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. And we prayed for the president today. We just didn't use his name, right?
With all the defections over civil rights and women's and gays and stuff,
Yeah.
are those defectors still organized out there, each in their own little world? And is what's left growing nationally and internationally?
Yeah. So did you all hear that question? So there are a group of defectors in recent times that have connected themselves with another Anglican church. So most of those cases have been churches in the United States connecting themselves with a church in Africa. And they say that the Nigerian bishop is their bishop because the Nigerian bishop is historically closed-minded on these issues. So that's what's mostly happened since 1990 forward, is that they've defected. If a whole church leaves, that's what they've done. And they call themselves an Anglican church, Suzanne. That's why I said that. Because you have to be careful now because they're calling themselves Anglican to separate themselves from Episcopal. But that's why they did it. Okay? Yep. No, say it.
The irony of a church splitting because they didn't want to have black people in their church, now joining with the African Anglicans is somewhat ironic to me.
Yep. Yeah, how about that? That's exactly true. Sadie.
I'm curious about more of the rationale for why the Episcopal Church had such an influence in politics in the 20th century. Like, is that to do with it being considered centrist in some way because there was a lack of taking sides in the Civil War? Or is that like, this is the American church? What was the reasoning?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. And Dino, you might be able to speak to this better. I assume you all know that Dino's brother is Dennis DeConcini. So he could probably tell you more about this from the political side of this. But what the church became from 1946 to 1960 was the safe church. It was the church that was not rocking any boats politically, and it was for lack of a better word, the elite church. It was where people that wanted to appear as if they were religious, even if they weren't, they tied themselves to the church to connect with that whole process, because the church wasn't going to say anything that was going to put them in an awkward position. And if you wanted to be connected with something, that's who you were. Now, I'm being a little pejorative here, and I get that, because there were plenty of other reasons why people were Episcopalian. But it was the elite church, and it was the church that wasn't going to say something that embarrassed you. So it became very easy to do that. So in those years, over 20% of Congress was Episcopalian, because that's what you did. And it just became the thing that you did. I hope that helps. Okay. But man, what did I say Wednesday? That ship has sailed. So those days are long gone. We burned those bridges, for better or worse. And of course, there were people who say, well, what's that? That was the heyday of the church. And I guess it was in some forms. But man, it's like not saying anything about what's going on in the world right now. How can you be a church and do that? I don't understand how that's even possible. And I believe that this is our central calling as Episcopalians right now, is to stand up for people that are being abused and hurt because of what's going on. And the Bishop of Minnesota, who I was with 2 weeks ago at our clergy retreat, said this is not political. This is social justice orientation, and he's right. But it is political too. So, and Jesus was political all the time, as far as I'm concerned. So I don't know how you be a church and not do that, but that's me. Good questions, you guys. How we doing? Okay. Did we sign? Did you put up? Great. Okay. And everybody got the sheets from last week? Okay. So next time, don't help me. What are we doing? Book of Common Prayer, right? Is that right? Yes? Okay. So we'll do the Book of Common Prayer and liturgy next time. And so we'll talk about liturgy from a church perspective, how we got to this place, that whole Protestant Catholic thing, how we put that together, why we do what we do. And you'll also get my take about liturgy, which is a little different than what the church generally says. So we'll talk about both those things. It's a pretty exciting class. It might sound a little boring, but it's not. I mean, that gets us into some real heavyweight issues.
I'll be out of town the next 2 weeks. Do you record it?
Yeah. So I should have said at the beginning, we have recorded this session. We're live streaming this session, and we did last week too. Last week's the live stream shut off at the beginning, but it recorded fine. So anybody who wants this week or last week, it's on YouTube, or you can just go on the website and find it. And we have them recorded from other years, so that's okay. The reason I'm saying all this is next week we might have to do this in the hall. And we can't live stream if it's in the hall, so folks that missed that, you might have to pick it up. So, no, it was going to be our bye week, but I changed it so that Faith in Action can meet during March too. So it's awkward because Early Music Society's here, but that's okay. So we might have to do it in the hall, but that way Faith in Action can meet March the 8th, and so that'll become our bye week, okay? So we'll skip. Faith in Action is going to meet March the 8th.
I thought we were meeting our migrant book thing then. That's the date that we can. I'll work it out with Ricky.
Okay.
I think we published that.
We have another event that day?
Yes.
We'll check that.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out.
Okay, we'll check that. And what I'm trying to do, y'all, it's just impossible, but we're trying not to have people competing for where, so you have to make a decision about where you're going. We just try really hard to not do that. So that's the idea. That's why we changed it, so Faith in Action could go March the 8th. But if we had something else, Migrant Book Group. And is that... No, it could be in the Bloom Room. Oh, except, okay, let's talk about that after, and we'll figure that out. Is that at noon? Is that at noon? No. It's in between services. Cool, then we're fine. Then we're fine. All right, we're cool. All right, good? Okay, so, good? All right. Thank you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You could lean on it, Mark. Oh, that's from your pew. Oh, I thought it was your pew.
Oh, whatever. Okay. Thank you, Paul.